Bubbles don't pop randomly. They all die from the same mathematical disease. On February 3, 1637, a single tulip bulb sold in Amsterdam for 10,000 guilders, more than a skilled craftsman's annual income, more than most houses in the city, more than a ship loaded with grain. The buyer, Pieter de Hooch, wasn't insane or recklessly speculative. He was making what appeared to be a mathematically sound investment decision based on price trends that had persisted for 3 years and showed no signs of stopping. De Hooch had calculated that tulip prices had increased 2,000% over the previous 36 months. He projected that continuing growth would make his investment worth 50,000 guilders within 2 years. His mathematical analysis assumed that recent price acceleration represented permanent market expansion rather than temporary speculation. It was a reasonable assumption based on available data, sophisticated mathematical modeling, and the collective wisdom of Amsterdam's most successful merchants. 6 weeks later, tulip prices collapsed 99%. De Hooch's 10,000 guilder investment became worthless. The Dutch economy entered recession. The world's first recorded speculative bubble had ended exactly as every bubble since has ended, through mathematical reality, overwhelming mathematical assumptions that extrapolated exponential growth beyond sustainable limits. The mathematical error that destroyed the Dutch tulip market in 1637 has appeared in every major speculative bubble throughout history. South Sea Company shares in 1720, railway stocks in 1840s Britain, Radio Corporation of America in 1929, Nifty 50 stocks in 1970, dot-com companies in 2000, housing prices in 2006. Every bubble, regardless of asset class or historical period, has died from identical mathematical miscalculation. The error isn't complex. It's devastatingly simple. Bubble participants consistently mistake temporary exponential growth for permanent exponential growth, extrapolating recent price performance indefinitely into the future, despite mathematical laws that make such extrapolation impossible. The error appears universal because human psychology systematically overrides mathematical judgment during periods of euphoric speculation. Understanding why bubbles always end with identical mathematical error requires recognizing the mathematical relationships between price, value, and growth sustainability that operate across all markets and historical periods. These relationships function according to laws as reliable as physics, but human psychology consistently violates mathematical constraints during speculative periods. Mathematical bubble analysis begins with understanding exponential versus linear growth patterns. Linear growth increases by consistent amounts over time. Exponential growth increases by consistent percentages, creating accelerating absolute increases that appear sustainable until mathematical limits are reached. Bubble formation occurs when market participants confuse exponential price increases with sustainable value creation. Tulip price growth from 1634 to 1637 followed mathematical exponential patterns that generated psychological conviction about continued appreciation. Early investors who purchased bulbs for 100 guilders and sold them for 500 guilders within months experienced returns that exceeded any previous investment experience. The mathematical success created psychological confidence that tulip appreciation represented permanent market expansion. This psychological confidence led to mathematical extrapolation that violated sustainability constraints. If tulip prices continued growing at recent rates, single bulbs would soon cost more than Amsterdam's entire real estate market. Mathematical logic suggested such extrapolation was impossible, but euphoric psychology overwhelmed mathematical judgment until price collapse restored mathematical reality. The South Sea Bubble of 1720 demonstrated identical mathematical psychology despite occurring in different country, different century, and different asset class. South Sea Company shares increased from $100 to $1,000 within 8 months, creating mathematical returns that generated widespread investor euphoria and systematic extrapolation beyond sustainable limits. Sir Isaac Newton, history's greatest mathematical mind, invested $7,000 in South Sea Company shares based on mathematical projections that extrapolated recent growth rates indefinitely. Newton's calculations showed that continued appreciation would make his investment worth $70,000 within 2 years. His mathematical genius couldn't protect him from psychological bias that made sustainable growth analysis impossible during speculative euphoria. When South Sea shares collapsed from $1,000 to $100, Newton lost his entire investment and reportedly declared that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of the people. Newton's mathematical expertise was useless during bubble conditions because the mathematical error driving bubbles operates through psychological mechanisms that override analytical capability. The 1929 stock market bubble revealed identical mathematical patterns despite technological advancement and sophisticated financial analysis that should have prevented mathematical extrapolation errors. Radio Corporation of America shares increased from $85 to $549 in 18 months, creating mathematical growth rates that generated systematic investor euphoria. Professional analysts calculated that RCA's revenue growth justified exponential stock price appreciation indefinitely. Mathematical models showed that continued technological expansion would support stock prices reaching $2,000 per share within 5 years. The projections appeared mathematically sound based on recent performance data and technological trend analysis. But mathematical extrapolation of exponential growth violated sustainability constraints that became obvious only after price collapse restored mathematical reality. RCA shares fell from $549 to $28 within 3 years, demonstrating that exponential price growth had exceeded mathematical relationships between stock prices and underlying business value. The mathematical relationship between bubble psychology and extrapolation error appears consistent across all speculative episodes because human cognitive biases operate according to predictable patterns that violate mathematical logic during euphoric periods. Recency bias causes investors to weight recent performance more heavily than long-term averages. Confirmation bias causes investors to seek information supporting predetermined conclusions about continued price appreciation. These psychological biases create mathematical misconceptions that make bubble formation inevitable when certain market conditions develop. Rising prices generate psychological euphoria that impairs mathematical judgment about sustainability limits. Euphoric psychology creates feedback loops where mathematical extrapolation errors become self-reinforcing until reality forces correction. The dot-com bubble of 1999-2000 provided contemporary demonstration of mathematical extrapolation errors, despite sophisticated computer modeling and modern financial analysis. Amazon shares increased from $18 to $113 within 2 years, creating mathematical growth rates that appeared to justify indefinite exponential appreciation. Professional analysts calculated that Internet adoption would support exponential revenue growth that justified stock price appreciation to $500 per share or higher. Mathematical models incorporated network effects, first-mover advantages, and technological disruption patterns that appeared to support exponential valuation increases indefinitely. Amazon's business model appeared mathematically superior to traditional retail because Internet sales eliminated geographical constraints and physical infrastructure costs. Mathematical analysis suggested that exponential growth represented permanent competitive advantage rather than temporary market euphoria. But mathematical extrapolation violated sustainability constraints that became apparent during price correction. Amazon shares fell from $113 to $7 within 2 years, demonstrating that exponential price growth had exceeded mathematical relationships between stock values and achievable business performance, even for revolutionary companies. The housing bubble of 2003-2006 demonstrated mathematical extrapolation error in different asset class, but with identical psychological and mathematical patterns. Housing prices increased 15% annually in major markets, creating mathematical appreciation rates that generated widespread belief in permanent real estate value expansion. Mathematical models developed by banks, rating agencies, and government regulators projected that continued housing appreciation would persist indefinitely because supply constraints and demographic trends supported exponential price growth. The models incorporated sophisticated statistical analysis and historical data that appeared to validate exponential extrapolation assumptions. Professional real estate analysts calculated that housing prices would continue rising 10–15% annually for decades because population growth and geographic constraints made exponential appreciation mathematically inevitable. The projections generated systematic investment and lending decisions based on mathematical extrapolation that violated sustainability principles. Housing price collapse from 2007–2009 revealed mathematical impossibility of exponential appreciation continuing indefinitely. Median housing prices fell 30% nationally, while some markets declined 60%, demonstrating that mathematical extrapolation had exceeded sustainable relationships between housing costs and household incomes. The mathematical error appears identical across all historical examples because exponential growth, when extrapolated indefinitely, always violates mathematical constraints imposed by underlying economic relationships. No asset can appreciate exponentially forever because exponential mathematics eventually produce values that exceed total economic output. If tulip bulbs had continued appreciating at 1634–1637 rates, single bulbs would have cost more than global GDP within decades. If South Sea shares had maintained 1719–1720 growth rates, the company would have been worth more than all global assets within years. If dot-com stocks had sustained 1999–2000 appreciation, technology companies would have exceeded total world wealth. Mathematical extrapolation always violates sustainability constraints because exponential growth produces values that become mathematically impossible within finite economic systems. The mathematical limits are predictable and calculable, but euphoric psychology consistently ignores mathematical constraints until price collapse forces recognition of extrapolation errors. The psychological mechanism driving mathematical extrapolation errors operates through cognitive biases that systematically impair mathematical judgment during speculative periods. Availability heuristic causes investors to base probability assessments on easily recalled examples of recent price appreciation rather than long-term mathematical relationships. Anchoring bias causes investors to use recent high prices as reference points for future value projections rather than mathematical analysis of sustainable pricing based on underlying fundamentals. These biases create systematic mathematical errors that make bubble formation inevitable when market conditions generate sustained price appreciation. Current market conditions demonstrate identical mathematical extrapolation patterns across multiple asset classes simultaneously. Cryptocurrency prices have increased exponentially, generating mathematical projections that extrapolate recent appreciation indefinitely despite mathematical impossibility of continued exponential growth. Artificial intelligence stocks have appreciated at rates that generate systematic mathematical extrapolation beyond sustainable limits. Professional analysts project that AI revolution will support exponential stock price growth indefinitely, creating mathematical assumptions that violate sustainability constraints identical to previous bubble episodes. Meme stock appreciation has created mathematical growth rates that generate widespread belief in permanent value expansion despite underlying business fundamentals that cannot support exponential valuation increases. The mathematical patterns are identical to historical bubbles, despite different technological and social media contexts. The mathematical universality of bubble formation and collapse suggests that speculative episodes represent mathematical inevitability rather than random market events. When certain psychological and market conditions develop, mathematical extrapolation errors become systematic and widespread, creating bubble conditions that must eventually correct through price collapse. Understanding bubbles as mathematical phenomena rather than psychological aberrations provides insight into why bubble prediction and prevention remain impossible despite historical experience and sophisticated analytical capabilities. The mathematical errors driving bubbles operate through psychological mechanisms that override analytical judgment regardless of educational background or professional expertise. Mathematical expertise cannot prevent bubble participation because the psychological biases causing extrapolation errors operate below conscious awareness during euphoric periods. Even mathematically sophisticated investors like Isaac Newton make systematic extrapolation errors when psychological conditions impair mathematical judgment about sustainability constraints. The mathematical progression of bubble formation follows predictable patterns that appear across all historical examples. Initial price appreciation generates psychological excitement that impairs mathematical judgment about sustainability limits. Continued appreciation creates euphoric psychology that makes mathematical extrapolation errors systematic and widespread. Exponential price growth creates feedback loops where mathematical projections become increasingly divorced from sustainable relationships between prices and underlying values. Euphoric psychology makes mathematical reality invisible until price collapse forces recognition of extrapolation errors through wealth destruction. The mathematical inevitability of bubble collapse means that exponential price appreciation always ends through correction that restores mathematical relationships between asset prices and sustainable values. The timing varies depending on psychological and market factors, but mathematical correction is inevitable once extrapolation errors reach sufficient levels. Current market valuations across multiple asset classes suggest mathematical extrapolation errors approaching levels that historically precede bubble collapse. Cryptocurrency, technology, and meme stock valuations reflect mathematical projections that extrapolate recent performance beyond sustainability constraints. The mathematical patterns are identical to previous bubble episodes, despite technological advancement and sophisticated analytical capabilities that should prevent extrapolation errors. Human psychology systematically overrides mathematical judgment during euphoric periods, making bubble formation and collapse mathematically inevitable rather than merely probable. Mathematical analysis of historical bubbles reveals that price collapse timing correlates with mathematical relationships between asset prices and underlying sustainable values rather than random market psychology or external events. When mathematical extrapolation reaches certain multiples of sustainable valuations, correction becomes inevitable regardless of psychological factors. The mathematical disease that kills every bubble operates through psychological mechanisms that make extrapolation errors systematic during euphoric periods. Recent price appreciation generates mathematical projections that violate sustainability constraints until reality forces correction through wealth destruction that restores mathematical relationships. Every bubble dies from the same mathematical error because human psychology consistently mistakes temporary exponential growth for permanent exponential growth, creating mathematical extrapolation that violates sustainability limits. The error appears universal because psychological biases operate according to predictable patterns that override mathematical judgment during speculative euphoria. Bubbles don't pop randomly. They die from mathematical disease that appears in every speculative episode throughout history. The disease is psychological, the symptoms are mathematical, and the outcome is inevitable collapse when extrapolation errors exceed sustainability constraints that mathematical reality always enforces through price correction.